Okay, now I'd like to talk about gender and the parent child relationship. And I want to talk about this from a bi-directional perspective, which is a perspective that assumes that parents have enormous influence on children. That's sort of obvious and goes without saying, but that children also socialize their parents in certain ways that have to do with gender. So the arrows of influence between parents and children in terms of how they live as gendered individuals, gendered people, actually flow both ways. It's not always just about parents kind of, imprinting this template on their children. So we're going to start from the parental perspective. To put this in context, some of the what's been going on with gender and parenting over the past few decades, we have to return once again to that SNAF baby boom era, where many of the expectations about what constitutes good parenting, being a good mother, being a good father, those expectations were set, and then compare it with the way things really are today, partway through the 21st century. So, as you probably remember from a little bit previous in the lecture, average number of children per woman has dropped dramatically to less than two children per woman on average, which means that for many women, they may have no children or they may have one. And for some women, they may have more than the average. So, what that means in terms of parenting is that, and again, I'm sort of returning to what we talked about earlier. Women in 2017 are going to spend a lot less of their life as the mother of a very young child than their mother's generation or their grandmother's generation. So this idea of being a mother is full time all the time uh, makes a bit more sense, perhaps, when you're looking at an average of four children, which you start having, at a quite young age, but doesn't exactly fit with the experience of spending a much shorter portion of your adult life in, sort of down in the trenches of caring for children who require a great deal of care and beginning that work at a later point in your adult life. Yet still, the expectation that motherhood is or ought to be a woman's primary occupation as an adult, we have that expectation, that sense that this is how it ought to be, is still with us. Looking at the average age at which women have their first child, we see that in 1962, the average maternal age at first birth was about 23. And by 2016, the average age at which the first child was born was edging up on 30. Now, you could look at these figures and say, well, that's not even a 6 year difference. That's not, not huge. It's not like people in the 1960s were having their kids when they were 12, and people in 2016 weren't getting started on childbearing until 45. But when you think about what those years are, those early to mid 20s, those years there are really crucial for adult life. Those are typically the years when people are continuing their post secondary education, when they're getting established in a career path, in an occupation, or just finding work, moving into the paid labor force. And for women, the timing of childbirth around that has shifted um, to a point where the women having children for the first time now typically have completed education. We know a lot more women, oh, there goes my laptop again. A lot more women are in post secondary education than has ever been the case in the past, and certainly a lot more than men. And women who are embarking on motherhood are also more likely to have had experience in the paid workforce behind them. They're not, they may be leaving a job or a career for childbearing, or they may be attempting to sort of sequence the demands of childcare with the demands of work or a career, but they're in a position where there's the potential for much more competition between childbearing and all the other things that one does as an adult. You may be looking at this and thinking, okay, so where are the men? And the short answer is we don't have good statistics on the men. Statistics Canada isn't collecting men's information about, how many children the average man has or how old the average man is when his first child is born. And the fact that there is this information gap just really points us towards sort of the gendered social construction of parenting, that this is primarily a concern of women. So we're going to collect a lot of information about women, but it's kind of secondary, or not, it's not quite so central for men. So we're not even going to collect the information or figure out on average how old men are when they have their first child. So we have these trends. We have fewer births overall per woman, and we have women who are older at the time of that their first child is born. And there are some developments in terms of parenting that flow from these demographic changes. One is so-called nucleated parenting. As parents are older, they are more likely to be raising their children, taking on all the work that's entailed there, just themselves, with less involvement from their own parents, who will, again, be older than they would have been in previous generations, or from other people. So the work of parenting becomes intensified and attached to the biological parent or parents of the particular child. And this is a sort of an interesting cultural phenomenon. Some of you may have come from other societies or other countries to live in Canada, or you may have visited and traveled a fair bit. And people from other societies are often quite surprised by how nucleated parenting is in Canada, the extent to which the work and the responsibility is downloaded on one or two individuals, the biological or legal parents of the child. So it's pretty concentrated. In other cultures and other societies, the work of child raising is much more diffused and shared and spread through networks of people that are attached to the child. So all of this is to say is in Canada, it can be kind of intense. As I mentioned earlier, the older age at first birth means that for people of all genders, childbearing and caring for children potentially competes with other adult life projects, because a greater chunk of adult lifetime is spent outside those years of intense parenting. And in fact, even before parenting starts, men and women have typically laid down some of the foundations for their adult life in terms of education, work, maybe buying a home, all of these other things. And this sets the stage for a couple of phenomena. One is and we haven't got this right yet, the clash between so-called earning and caring, or between what's going on in the workforce and what's going on at home. And you may remember that I mentioned earlier the notion of a half-changed world or a stalled revolution, where some institutions have changed a great deal in terms of gender and others sort of haven't. And we come up against that here. So patterns of childbearing and parenting have changed a great deal over the last few decades. Yet many, if not most, workplaces are still sort of premised on this idea that there is a parent at home, usually assumed to be the mom, or there is a parent whose time is very flexible, who can take on this sort of unpaid work so that the other parent can remain in the workforce more or less as needed by their employer. So this is why, for instance, schools end at 3:30, but the typical, typical in quotation marks, 9 to 5 job doesn't end until you got it 5 o'clock. Or why uh, pediatricians, doctors, dentists schedule appointments for children during the middle of the day. Um, Yet employers are often, less than flexible when it comes to someone disappearing for 2 hours in the middle of their shift because they need to take their kid for an eye checkup or they need to go see a specialist or do something or other. So the models of work that we are living with might function when there was that extra adult around to take on all that full-time parenting, but they clash with the reality, which is that you've got uh, typically two parents in the workforce. Neither may have this infinitely flexible time, and yet the child there has needs that must be met. Parenting has demands that have to be attended to. The way this tends to play out is quite gendered, and this is probably a surprise to nobody to hear that when it comes to who takes time away from the paid workforce in order to do childcare, who takes the bulk of parental leave, who is expected to or chooses to be flexible in order to meet the needs of parenting and childcare, that tends to be women. So women are like this sort of buffer that enables earning and caring to go on at the same time because they are more likely than their male counterparts to step out of the workforce and step aside. And this produces what we can call gendered opportunity costs. So the time that you take out of the full-time workforce, although it's, it may be enormously rewarding and rich and wonderful to stay home with children or parent children, is a time when women are foregoing professional opportunities. They're foregoing the ability to earn more money, to earn a higher income. They're foregoing promotion opportunities to move up or to change jobs in ways that will bring financial advantage. They're taking a hit in terms of opportunities in order to engage in full-time parenting to an extent that that men are not. Going along with this and kind of exacerbating the gender discrepancy is what sociologists have called the ideology of intensified parenting. Those of you who've taken sociology of the family may be familiar with the idea of concerted cultivation, this way of viewing children as though they were these sort of precious hothouse flowers that have to be tended and have to be watched over very, very carefully in order for them to blossom. Kids are like orchids. They're not like dandelions or sunflowers that will just grow kind of fine on their own. So historians of childhood look at the sort of intensification of parenting, especially in the middle classes, and the rise of experts and authorities telling parents, which in practical terms usually translates into telling mothers, that they have to do all of this work. They have to put in all of this time and energy and resources into cultivating this one or maybe two or three very special children, or they will have failed as a parent. And it's a gendered failure. It's the failure of a mother to adequately provide the guidance and the input and the money and the energy and the time to cultivate her child. This is an ideology of child rearing. It's not universal. It's not even hegemonic within the middle class. To be called a helicopter parent is generally not a good thing. But even though people are ambivalent about it, intensified parenting as an ideology of parenting has become more and more dominant and has generated its own sort of industries and experts and authorities. Um, and it's mainly fallen on women to carry out the work that's associated with it. So what's going on with the men? If women are still the ones taking a hit in career terms and are still interpolated by intensified parenting, well, compared to previous generations of fathers, the fathers today are indeed more involved with their children, including at earlier ages. So, the average father in 2016 probably spends more time with his young child or children than his father did or his grandfather did. And compared to his father or grandfather, the average dad in the 21st century is probably a little bit less gender rigid in terms of, you know, like wanting boys to be boys and girls to be girls and so forth, or refusing to take on certain tasks because those are mother's work, like changing diapers or feeding kids or what have you. So even though we've seen some movement in terms of transformed parenting and gender relations, nonetheless, as you shall see in just a moment, there's still a big caregiving gap that is remarkably durable between men and women. And before I get to that gap, just as a sort of, reminder of how pervasive these gendered cultural notions of parenting are, um, you can, try this out yourself. Look in an online dictionary for father as a verb, and you'll get a lot of things that refer to pretty basic biological processes, like to beget, to procreate, to spawn, to sow the seed. That's what it means to father somebody. Now try this with to mother, and you'll get a lot of synonyms that refer to interpersonal care and attention and support. So if we look for to mother as a verb, we're not, we don't get a lot of biological stuff. We get care for, tend, nurture, take care, watch over, support, and on and on and on. So even within the English language, there's this sort of implied division that the actual work of parenting, beyond just, spawning and sowing the seed, is feminized in some way or belongs more properly to women when we look at what it means linguistically to mother. And what it means to father is, even embedded in our language, a much narrower and less ambitious range of activities. So we're still, as a society, working to change that. Here's what mothering and fathering, or gendered parenting, looks like in terms of hours per week of childcare. And this is from a StatsCan study in 2010. And it's divided by it was a study of couples who are have a co-residing with a child under 18, and it's divided by the employment status of the couples. So women are brown, men are this sort of orangey color. And as we go from left to right, we have dual earner couples where men and women are both employed full time. Single earner couples where the man is employed full time. Single couples where the woman is employed full time. And couples in which nobody is an earner. Both are unemployed or out of the workforce for some reason. And what you'll see in terms of hours per week, that in every arrangement of employment status, women still report many more hours per week in childcare than men do. I mean, this is most pronounced in couples where there's a single earner and it's the man. It sort of makes sense. Woman would be more available because she's at home, so she'd be doing more childcare. But even in couples where the single earner is the woman, she's still logging more than twice as many hours in childcare as the non-earning, not in the workforce man. And that's the persistent power of gender schemas, that even when the you'd look at this and you'd think in terms of who's available, who has time to do childcare, it still falls out in this very gendered pattern. And this doesn't, there's been some change in this over the last few decades, but not a whole lot. Okay. So from the perspective, that was from the perspective of parents, what does it look like from this perspective of children to have a gendered childhood as part of a family with parent-child relationships? One of the striking findings in sociology and psychology on gender and parenting is that, and this again gets us to our half-changed world, stalled revolution thing, is that although most parents say explicitly that they believe in gender neutrality, they're not going to treat their sons, drastically differently from their daughters. They'll give their daughter wants to play with a truck, that's fine. If their son wants to play with a Barbie, that's kind of fine. But in practice, observational studies indicate that people still do whatever their conscious commitments may be. In practice, they're still treating children differently. And there are many dimensions along which gendered parenting falls, or which we can look at. One, I'm just pulling out a few here. One is spatial proximity. How far away from the parent figure in terms of just physical space can a young child go, a toddler, let's say, before the parent kind of yanks them back or brings them back? And observational studies suggest that parents will let boys get much further away from them before retrieving the child than they will with girl babies or girl toddlers, who have a much sort of small or geographic space that they can occupy, and the parent can be okay with that. So even from very early on, the treatment of boys and girls in terms of who can venture further out into the world away from parents appears to be gendered and different. Significance of physical appearance is another area where gender differences show up. Little boys tend to get significantly fewer compliments on how good they look as compared to little girls. And if you've worked around young children, or you've worked at a daycare or been to, a day home or something like that, you may actually have seen this yourself. Little girls get a lot of positive feedback on how pretty they are, how well dressed they are, how cute they look, and so forth. Young boys not only don't get as much physical appearance feedback, they get more feedback on their activities, how strong they are, how tough they are, how fast they can run, these sorts of things. So what that does is it sets up an expectation that physical appearance, visual appearance for girls is going to be a much bigger deal, looking nice and looking cute and so forth, than it is for boys, where it's what you do that's going to matter. Another dimension where parenting differs has to do with how parents react to, and doing the air quote thing, atypical gender behavior. So the little girl who picks up a dump truck and starts hitting some other kid over the head with it, or the little boy who wants to do his nails with glitter and play with Barbies and so forth. And even though I believe Canada is moving towards a state of being much more uh, inclusive of gender diverse expressions, again, research still shows that there's a difference. little girls who exhibit gender atypical behavior are much more likely to be praised or supported by their parents for being strong or tough or what have you. Whereas little boys who want to play with Barbies or wanted to, paint their toenails, are more likely to be subtly or not so subtly corrected. Parents divert them into doing something else, or sometimes actively tell them, no, don't do that, that's for girls, or simply react with non-reaction. They don't praise the boy or say, isn't that cute? Or, look at how much you love Barbie, isn't that wonderful? And so that behavior on the boy's part doesn't reap the same kind of positive reinforcement that gender crossing on the part of girls do. So little boys get a very different reception to their gender transgressive, again in air quotes, behavior than little girls do, which sends messages about what kind of behavior do we value more in children. And finally, one other area which is pretty fascinating with gendered parents gendering their children has to do with how emotional expressions are understood according to the gender of the child who is expressing them. And there's some famous experiments in psychology where parents were shown pictures or they were shown video clips of a baby with no gender markings, like no, little pink headbands or superhero t-shirts or whatever, crying and very upset. And then the adults were asked, okay, what's going on with the baby? Like, come up with a story about why this baby is unhappy. And when participants in this experiment were told that the baby was a boy, and I'm realizing I've just got this backwards on the screen, they were much more likely to read the child's distress as anger. When they were told that the baby was a girl, they were much more likely to interpret her emotional expression as being fear. I'm like, do I have time to change that now? No, probably I don't. The important thing to remember is that distress was interpreted more as fear among when it was understood that the infant who was distressed was a girl, and understood more as anger when the participants were told the infant that was distressed was a boy. So when you do something that a child doesn't like and they start crying, if they're a boy infant, is it because they're mad, they're angry, they're filled with hostility, they don't like this? If they're a girl infant, is it because they're scared, they're frightened, they need to be comforted, they need to be soothed and told, everything's okay, you're safe, you're secure, nothing can hurt you? Parental interpretation of the cues they get from their children appear to be quite different depending on the gender of the child.